In this series of short videos, we'll explore how and when to use Photoshop along with Lightroom to take your photos to the next level. Lightroom is great for organizing and sharing your photos, and Lightroom's user-friendly editing controls are often all you'll need to make a photo look its best. But sometimes you'll want to do something more with your photos than you can accomplish in Lightroom, like maybe combining multiple photos or moving an object in a photo. And you'll want to save your photos with their Photoshop edits back to Lightroom to keep track of all your photos in one place. I'm going to walk you through each of those common scenarios and more for using Photoshop with Lightroom in this video series. But first, let's get familiar with the basic editing workflow from Lightroom to Photoshop and back. First, I do most of my photo editing here in Lightroom's Develop module, making adjustments to tone, color, and other photo qualities. As a simple example, I'll click the Auto button here in the Basic panel, which automatically adjusts exposure, contrast, and these other tonal values. I can tweak any of these sliders, and I can add more adjustments. When I'm done making those adjustments, I'll take a look at the photo and see if there's any reason to take it over to Photoshop. In this case, I'd like to remove this colt from the photo. Photoshop is the best place to do this because Photoshop has sophisticated retouching tools that are great at removing larger areas of content like this. Now, I could open this photo directly from my hard drive into Photoshop using Photoshop's File Open command, but then my Photoshop edits wouldn't automatically show up back here in Lightroom. So instead, I'm going to use a Lightroom command, the Edit In command. I'll right-click the photo, or you can Control-click if necessary on your device, and I'll choose Edit In. Then I'll choose Edit in Adobe Photoshop. In the next dialog, I'll choose Edit a Copy with Lightroom Adjustments, because what I want to do is have a copy of this original photo taken over to Photoshop, and I want that copy to include the Lightroom adjustments that I just made, and these other options don't do that. By the way, if you're working with a RAW file, you won't see this dialog. Instead, your RAW file will be passed straight from Lightroom to Photoshop at this point, skipping this dialog box. But I'm working with a JPEG, a non-RAW file, and so I do see this dialog box. I'm going to click Edit. That switches me over to Photoshop and opens the file in Photoshop with all the adjustments that I made in Lightroom. Now let's remove the colt from this file. I'm going to try to use the Content-Aware Fill method to do this. I'll select one of the selection tools in the Tools panel. I'll go with the Lasso tool, which draws free-form selections. And then I'll move over, and I'll draw a selection around the colt, making sure to include a little of the surrounding area. Now I'll go to the Edit menu, and I'll choose Fill. And in the Fill dialog, I'll make sure that Contents is set to Content Aware, and I'll click OK. And the colt is magically gone from the scene and replaced with new content that matches the surrounding area. I'm done with the selection, so I'll go up to the Select menu and choose Deselect to remove the selection boundary. Now I'll save the image so that my Photoshop edits show up in a copy back in Lightroom. I'll go to the File menu in Photoshop, and I'll choose Save. Take a look at the Document tab. Saving caused the file name to change in two ways. The word Edit was automatically added to the file name, and the file format is now TIFF, which is the default file format for images passed from Lightroom to Photoshop and back. Now I can close the saved image in Photoshop and return to Lightroom. In the film strip, there are now two copies of the photo. The selected version, which you see up here in the document window, is the TIFF copy that we just saved from Photoshop. It contains both the change that we made in Photoshop, the colt is gone, and the adjustments to tone and color that we made in Lightroom before passing the copy to Photoshop. Next to the TIFF copy in the film strip is another version. This is the original JPEG. It contains the adjustments that we made in Lightroom. You can see them over here in the Basic panel, but not the change that we made in Photoshop because we didn't pass the original to Photoshop. So that's the basic workflow for moving photos between Lightroom and Photoshop. You'll use the same workflow in the other videos in this series, each of which focuses on a different common situation in which you can take your photos further by taking them from Lightroom to Photoshop and back.